In a courtroom, the air was thick with tension. The judge sat at the front, stern-faced, with a stack of papers in front of him, and the rest of the courtroom seemed to hold its breath. The case before them was one of deep family turmoil, a story that had been unfolding for months. But no one expected what happened next. No one expected a 7-year-old girl to stand up, walk to the stand, and tell a truth so powerful, so raw, it shook everyone in the room to their core. This was no ordinary child, and this was no ordinary moment. As she nervously approached the podium, her small hands gripping the edges for support, her eyes locked onto the judges with a depth that seemed far beyond her years. The courtroom was quiet, too quiet, as if the very walls themselves were holding their breath, waiting for her words. What happened next would leave everyone questioning everything they thought they knew about the situation. But before we dive into the full story, let's rewind just a bit. You see, this little girl had been through so much in her young life, living in a world where the grown-ups around her couldn't agree on what was best. There were accusations, emotions running high, and a custody battle that had been going on for months. But through it all, one thing remained certain. This little girl wanted to tell the truth. And when she finally got her chance, she didn't hold back. Her father had always been a figure of authority in her life, someone who was supposed to be a protector, a source of safety. But there were whispers, things she didn't understand fully, but enough to make her feel uneasy. She'd heard stories from family members, seen the way people spoke in hushed tones when his name came up. But it wasn't until that moment in the courtroom that she truly understood the weight of what she was about to say. With her voice barely above a whisper, she began speaking. Her words, innocent yet piercing, revealed the truth about her father, a truth that no one had been prepared to hear. It was a moment of vulnerability, courage, and raw honesty. And as she spoke, something in the room shifted. The judge, the attorneys, even the witnesses could feel the gravity of her words. You could almost hear the collective gasp as they realized the depth of what was unfolding before them. But just as quickly as the truth was spoken, something else began to happen. The reactions were immediate. The judge's face hardened. The mother in the courtroom looked stricken, her eyes welling up with tears. And the father, well, his expression was unreadable, a mask of emotions he couldn't hide. But what was his next move? Would he defend himself, try to silence her? Or would he face the truth she had just laid bare? As the little girl finished speaking, the room seemed to freeze in time. The tension was unbearable. What would happen now? How would this change everything for her and her family? Her words had ignited a firestorm, but what would come of it? Would justice prevail, or would this young girl's bravery lead to even more heartbreak? The courtroom awaited the next steps, and so did everyone watching. What happened next will leave you on the edge of your seat. Stay tuned, because this is only the beginning of a story that will unfold in ways no one could have expected. The courtroom remained silent, the weight of the little girl's words hanging in the air like an unspoken promise. Everyone, from the judge to the lawyers, to the onlookers in the gallery, could feel the power of her truth. It wasn't just what she said, it was how she said it, with a calmness that seemed impossible for a child so young. But in the eyes of the people in that room, it was clear that this was a moment no one would ever forget. To understand why this moment was so powerful, you have to understand the story that had led up to it. This wasn't just a typical custody battle or family dispute. This was a fight that had been brewing for years, and at the heart of it were two people, her father and her mother, who had once promised each other forever, only to fall apart in a way that was far more complicated than anyone had imagined. Their separation had been messy, filled with accusations, misunderstandings, and a deepening resentment that had poisoned the relationship they once shared. Her father had always been a larger-than-life figure in her world. He was charismatic, charming even, and to those who didn't know him well, he was everything a father was supposed to be: strong, protective, and dependable. But for those who looked a little closer, the cracks began to show. There were stories that didn't quite add up, whispered in dark corners and behind closed doors. Some said he was controlling, others said he was angry. And as the years went by, his temper seemed to grow shorter, his patience wearing thin. But it wasn't until the divorce that the true nature of their relationship came to light. Her mother, having been in the marriage for years, began to see the man she had loved with different eyes. The abusive behavior that had once been masked by charm and affection began to show itself, and she found herself trapped in a situation she hadn't known how to escape from. The custody battle was long and painful. Every hearing, every court date, only deepened the divide between the parents. But for their daughter, this was no ordinary fight. She had a front-row seat to it all, and as she got older, she started to pick up on the tension, the angry words that were exchanged behind closed doors, the sudden outbursts from her father when things didn't go his way. She didn't fully understand it at first, but she could feel it. She could feel the change in the air when he came around, the way the room grew colder when his voice raised in anger, the way her mother seemed to shrink whenever he was near. The thing that most people didn't realize was that she had been watching. She had been paying attention, seeing things that the adults in her life never thought she would notice. She saw her father's mood swings, his harsh words, and his unpredictable behavior. But she also saw the love he had for her, or at least, the way he showed it when things were calm. He would play with her, tell her stories, and make her laugh. He would be the dad she wished she could keep forever. But then, there were the moments that didn't make sense. The anger, the tension, the fear in her mother's eyes when her father would visit. It was confusing for her, and as a young child, she didn't have the language to express what she was feeling. All she knew was that something wasn't right. And the more she watched, the more she began to realize that she was living in a world that didn't quite match up to the one she had been told about. By the time the court date had arrived, the one where she would finally be called to speak, it had been a long, difficult road for her. She had been called to testify, but no one expected her to actually take the stand. They didn't think she was old enough to fully understand what was at stake. But she knew. She had seen enough to understand that her father wasn't the person he appeared to be. And when her mother asked her if she was ready to tell the truth, she hesitated. She had been scared. Scared of what might happen if she spoke out. Scared of how her father might react. But something changed in her that day. It was like a switch flipped, and she realized that no matter how scared she was, the truth had to come out. She had to be brave, not just for herself, but for her mother and for the future she wanted to build. Her words, as innocent as they were, carried the weight of a truth that could not be ignored. As she told her story in that courtroom, it wasn't just the content of her words that caused the shock. It was the way she said them. Her voice was steady, almost too steady for someone so young. And as she spoke, it was clear that she wasn't just telling her side of the story. She was telling the truth, her truth, the one she had been holding inside for so long. The judge, who had seen hundreds of cases in his career, was visibly shaken. The attorneys were scrambling, trying to process the information, unsure of how to proceed. The mother, who had been so strong for so long, could barely hold back her tears. But it was the father's reaction that left everyone stunned. For a moment, he just stood there, staring at his daughter, as if he couldn't believe what he was hearing. His face twisted in a way that suggested disbelief, anger, and something else, something darker, something that made the room shiver. But then, just as quickly as the moment had arrived, it was over. The little girl finished her testimony and was led back to her seat, her hands still trembling, but her head held high. She had done it. She had told the truth. And now, the question remained, what would happen next? Would the father try to deny it? Would he retaliate? Or would he face the consequences of his actions? The tension in the room was unbearable, and the judge's gavel came down, signaling a brief recess. But it didn't bring any relief. The story was far from over. The courtroom was filled with whispers as everyone waited for the next move. Would the truth be enough to change the course of the battle, or would this brave little girl's words lead to even more chaos and heartbreak? As the door to the courtroom closed behind the judge, everyone could feel it, the shift in the air, the unsettling sense that nothing would ever be the same again. The real question now was, what would happen when the full weight of this revelation came crashing down? And who would be left standing when the dust finally settled? The courtroom was still. It was as if the walls themselves had absorbed the truth that had just been laid bare. The judge's gavel echoed in the silence, but even it couldn't break the heavy air. Outside, the sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, casting a golden glow through the windows. It should have been a peaceful scene, but inside, the world was anything but calm. As the recess continued, the atmosphere was thick with unanswered questions. The little girl sat quietly, her legs swinging beneath her seat, but her eyes were wide, alert. She had just spoken a truth so raw and powerful that the courtroom was still processing it, each person grappling with what they had just heard. But for her, the truth was something she had carried for so long that speaking it aloud was almost a relief, though it left a gnawing sense of unease in its wake. Her mother sat next to her, trying to maintain her composure, but the tears that had threatened to fall throughout the testimony now streaked down her face. She had known what was happening in their home, had known the subtle signs of manipulation, control, and anger. But hearing her daughter's words in front of everyone, hearing the truth spoken aloud in a way she couldn't deny, was something else entirely. It was one thing to suspect, to feel it in your gut. It was another to have it confirmed in the stark light of the courtroom. But even as she sat there, overwhelmed with emotion, she couldn't help but wonder if this would be enough. Would the truth of her daughter's words be enough to tip the scales in her favor, to finally end the years of manipulation and pain? Or would it only add fuel to the fire, pushing her ex-husband into an even darker, more dangerous corner? Her ex-husband, his face was unreadable. After the shock had worn off, he had remained silent, his eyes cold and distant, refusing to meet anyone's gaze. But inside, something was churning. How had it come to this? How had the walls of his carefully constructed world come crumbling down in the space of just a few moments? He had always known how to play the part of the doting father when he needed to. He knew how to charm and manipulate. He knew how to make people see him the way he wanted to be seen. But this was different. His daughter's words were a weapon he hadn't anticipated. She was his own flesh and blood, and yet she had turned against him in a way he hadn't been prepared for.
But there was more to it than that.
Beneath his mask of stoicism, there was a flicker of something darker. Anger.
Panic.
His mind was racing, already calculating his next move. He had always controlled the narrative, always made sure that he was the one in power, the one who dictated how things would go. But now, he wasn't sure where this was going. If the truth was really out, if his daughter's testimony had carried the weight he feared it had, he was losing control. And when he lost control, he had always known what came next. He would fight back.
Hard.
As the break continued, he began to rehearse his defense. He would claim she didn't understand, that she had been coerced into saying those things, that her mother had planted those ideas in her head. He had done it before, manipulated situations, twisted the narrative in his favor. He would do it again. It was a game he was skilled at, a game he had played so many times that the rules no longer felt real. He would fight, he would win, he always did. But this time, something felt different. There was a sense of urgency, a sense of slipping. Meanwhile, the attorneys in the room were busy strategizing. They were both taken aback by the gravity of the child's testimony. Her words, though innocent, were so stark that even they were unsure how to proceed. The defense lawyer, known for his sharp mind and quick thinking, was already planning his cross-examination. He knew how to discredit a witness, how to make people doubt what they heard. But the little girl's words had hit too close to home. She hadn't just been a bystander in her own story. She had been an active part of the truth, and that truth was undeniably powerful. The prosecution was equally wary. They had hoped for something, anything, to give them an edge in the case, but they hadn't expected this. They hadn't expected the little girl to be the one to tip the scales. Now, they had to figure out how to use her testimony without overwhelming the case or turning it into an emotional circus. The stakes were higher than ever, and with each passing moment, the tension was mounting. Then there was the question of what would happen next for the little girl. No matter how much courage she had shown, she was still just a child. The reality of what she had done hadn't fully sunk in for her yet, but it would. Her world was about to change, and she had no idea what that would look like. Would she be a hero? Would her bravery make the difference in her mother's fight? Or would the aftermath be something more painful, more complicated than she could have imagined? The weight of it all was starting to take its toll. As the recess stretched on, the mother took her daughter's hand, her heart full of both pride and fear. She had always known her daughter was strong, but this moment, this courageous act, was something else entirely. She had spoken the truth, and now there was no going back. The question was whether that truth would be enough to change everything. Would the system, the judge, the lawyers see it for what it was? Or would it all be brushed aside, buried under the weight of her father's manipulations? The hours passed slowly, the tension thickening with every minute. Everyone in that courtroom felt it. The waiting, the uncertainty, the slow, inevitable realization that nothing would be the same after this. And then, as the break came to a close, the door opened, and the judge returned to his seat. Everyone rose, and the room fell silent again. The next phase of the trial was about to begin. And what would happen in the coming hours, the next round of testimony, the arguments that would unfold, would be nothing short of a battle. The truth had been spoken, but its consequences were still to come. The courtroom would soon learn just how far the father would go to hold on to his power, and how much further his daughter's courage would take her in this fight for freedom. But no one knew yet how it would all unfold. As the judge settled back into his chair, the energy in the room shifted. It was as if everyone had been holding their breath, and now, with the gavel's sound, they all exhaled in unison. The little girl, still clutching her mother's hand, looked up at the judge with wide eyes. She was small, so small in that vast courtroom, yet she had just set in motion something much larger than herself. Her words had already done their job, but the consequences were still to unfold. The mother, her heart racing, was torn between hope and fear. She couldn't shake the image of her ex-husband's face when their daughter had spoken. His mask of calm had cracked just enough to reveal the simmering anger beneath the surface. She knew him well enough to understand that this was only the beginning. His reaction wasn't one of someone who was ready to back down. He wasn't done fighting. And that scared her. Her ex-husband, sitting across the room, was doing everything in his power to regain control of the situation. The tightness in his jaw was visible, his fingers tapping against the table in a rhythm that betrayed his growing anxiety. He had been thrown off balance, but his mind was already working furiously, calculating his next move. He would not let his daughter's testimony ruin everything he had worked for. He had too much at stake, too much power to lose. His lawyer, sensing the tension, leaned in close, whispering reassurances. "You know how to spin this. We'll just say she's confused. You can't let her words define everything." But even as his lawyer spoke, the father's mind wasn't fully on the conversation. He was fixated on his daughter, on her courage, on the raw truth she had shared. He couldn't let that truth stand. If it did, everything would change, everything he had controlled would slip through his fingers. He had always been the one in charge, the one with the upper hand. This was not supposed to happen. Meanwhile, the attorneys on the other side, though equally focused, could feel the weight of what had transpired. The little girl's testimony had shifted the dynamic. It was a game changer, but there was still so much more to prove. The case wasn't over. It was just beginning. Her words alone wouldn't be enough to guarantee a win. There were still obstacles to overcome. The father would fight back. Of that they were certain. And when he fought dirty. As the proceedings resumed, the tension in the room was palpable. Every word, every movement, every pause felt heavier than the last. The judge, no stranger to high-stakes cases, tried to maintain order, but even he could sense the shifting tides. He had seen it all before: custody battles that tore families apart, accusations that went unresolved, pain that lingered for years. But this was different. This little girl had spoken truth to power, and now the entire room had to reckon with it. And then came the cross-examination. The defense lawyer, slick and calculated, took his turn, stepping forward with a cold smile, his eyes scanning the room as if he were in complete control. He began with soft words, asking the little girl questions that seemed harmless at first, but the intent was clear: to undermine her credibility, to make her seem confused, to plant doubt in the minds of everyone listening. He began by asking her if she knew what the word manipulation meant, to which she shook her head, her small voice barely a whisper as she answered,
"No, sir."
The lawyer smiled, as if this small moment of hesitation had somehow given him the opening he needed. He pressed on, twisting her words, trying to make her seem uncertain, questioning whether she was being coached, whether her mother had put these ideas in her head. Each question came with a pointed accusation, an attempt to discredit the child's testimony, to turn the narrative around. But the little girl held her ground. Her eyes never wavered, even when the lawyer's voice grew sharper, more insistent. The tension in the courtroom was thickening with every word, every question. It was a battle of wills now, her innocence against his experience, her truth against his manipulation. She answered each question with a quiet but firm honesty that made the room hang on her every word. She wasn't backing down. Her mother, sitting beside her, could feel the weight of every question as though it were directed at her. It was like reliving all the moments she had spent in silence, all the years of wondering if anyone would ever believe her. And now, here her daughter was, speaking the truth, standing up against the very person who had torn their family apart. The father's lawyer, seeing the girl's unwavering resolve, switched tactics. He leaned forward, softening his tone, attempting a new strategy. "You love your father, don't you?" he asked, his voice gentle, almost coaxing. The little girl hesitated for a brief moment. She did love her father. She always had in her own way. But the truth she had spoken could no longer be ignored. She nodded slowly, her voice barely audible as she replied, "Yes, I love him. But he's not always kind." The room seemed to hold its breath. This wasn't just a child's testimony anymore. This was a revelation, a truth that had been buried for so long, hidden behind the walls of their home. The defense lawyer tried to twist her words, to make it seem like she was conflicted, but the truth had already been spoken. Her words, simple yet powerful, had already planted a seed of doubt that was impossible to erase. Her father sat motionless, the fury building inside him. Every word from his daughter felt like a betrayal, a sharp blow to everything he had tried to maintain. His anger was bubbling to the surface, but he forced himself to keep it contained, for now. The longer this dragged on, the more desperate he became. He knew what was coming, and he couldn't stop it. The momentum was shifting, and no matter how much he tried to fight it, the truth was starting to take root. But the courtroom was still far from resolved. The battle was far from over. The father would fight until the bitter end, and so would the mother. But now, with the little girl at the center, everything was hanging in the balance. Every eye in the room was fixed on the unfolding drama, wondering what would happen next. Would the father finally admit the truth, or would he tear his family apart even further? Would the mother's strength be enough to carry them through, or would the lies win out? As the tension reached its peak, the judge called for another brief recess. The room erupted into murmurs, but none of it could break the quiet desperation that had settled over the case. The next moments would determine everything. What would happen when they returned? Would the truth hold strong, or would the darkness creep back in? The weight of it all was unbearable, and the answers were still just out of reach. The gavel rang again, and the courtroom quieted, the air thick with anticipation. The brief recess had done little to ease the tension. Everyone was on edge, knowing the battle was far from over, and the next moments could tip the scales in ways they couldn't yet predict. But just as the judge began to speak, the door to the courtroom swung open abruptly, and the silence that followed was more unnerving than anything that had come before. A man entered, someone who hadn't been seen until now. His presence, calm and deliberate, cut through the room like a sharp blade. He wasn't just any man. He was the father's brother, the uncle of the little girl, a man with his own dark history, one that many thought had been buried. His appearance was unexpected, his arrival out of nowhere. He had kept a low profile throughout the entire trial. Some knew he had been close to the father, but few had ever suspected he might get involved. His reputation preceded him, quiet, calculating, and loyal to a fault. He had been the one person who'd always defended his brother, no matter what. But there was something unsettling about him that no one had fully understood. And now he was standing in that very courtroom. His eyes scanned the room, his gaze meeting the father's. A silent exchange passed between them, a look that said everything. The father's lips curled into a faint, almost imperceptible smile. It was the smile of someone who had just found a new ally in a war that was slipping through his fingers. The brother stepped forward, walking toward the judge with a kind of certainty that made the air grow even heavier. "I apologize for the interruption, Your Honor," the man said, his voice low and measured. "But I believe I have some information that could change the course of this case." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. The judge's eyes narrowed, his expression unreadable. "What kind of information?" he asked, his voice firm. The man glanced at the father, then turned back to the judge. "I've been in communication with my brother's legal team. There are things that have been left unsaid, things that have been hidden. I believe this information could reveal the true nature of the situation at hand." The audience in the room shifted uncomfortably. Everyone knew that this wasn't just about revealing facts anymore. There was something more at play. The uncle had always been a figure in the background, quietly watching from the sidelines. But now it was clear. He was stepping forward to make his move. The mother's heart skipped a beat. She knew that the father's brother had always been involved in the darker side of their family's past. There had been whispers over the years, accusations that had never been fully explored. But the idea that he was now playing a role in this courtroom drama sent chills down her spine. What could he possibly have to say that would make a difference? And why was he speaking up now? The judge motioned for him to continue. "You're claiming that there are details that could alter the case," he said, raising an eyebrow. "What details are these?" The uncle didn't flinch. "I know that there are witnesses who haven't been called yet. People who have seen things that weren't shared with the court. And I also have some evidence." He paused, his gaze locking on the mother. Evidence that could paint a different picture of what's been happening behind closed doors. The room went still. The air, once filled with tension, now felt suffocating. The father's lawyer shot him a quick look of approval, while the prosecution exchanged wary glances. Everyone knew that introducing new evidence at this stage of the trial wasn't just unusual, it could completely turn the tide of the case. The little girl, still seated beside her mother, could feel the change in the atmosphere. She didn't fully understand what was going on, but she sensed that something huge was happening. Her mother, too, could feel her pulse quicken. She had no idea what the uncle was about to say, but she could already tell it wasn't good. She had seen his influence in the past, seen how he had a way of making people question everything they thought they knew. The judge leaned forward. "What kind of evidence are we talking about?" The uncle's expression hardened. "It's not just about evidence, Your Honor. It's about context. There are certain things about the family dynamics, about what happened in their marriage, that were kept hidden from everyone. Things that could change the way this case is understood. Things that paint a much more complicated picture than what has been presented so far." A collective gasp went through the courtroom. The mother's face drained of color. She felt her stomach twist with fear. What was he implying? What did he know? And why was he bringing it up now, of all times? The judge hesitated, his brow furrowing as he tried to process the implications. "What exactly are you suggesting?" he asked, his voice now tinged with caution. The uncle didn't answer immediately. Instead, he stepped forward, pulling a small folder from his briefcase. He placed it on the judge's desk, his fingers brushing over it briefly before withdrawing. "I'm suggesting that there are things we don't know yet. That there are people, witnesses, who can confirm that the truth we're dealing with is much darker than it seems." The room was on edge now, every person's attention riveted on the man before the judge. The tension was unbearable. The little girl, still grasping her mother's hand, felt the weight of every eye on her, and though she didn't fully understand the magnitude of what was happening, she felt a deep sense of foreboding. The mother's thoughts were racing. The past few years had already been a blur of pain and betrayal, but this was different. This was something new, something that threatened to break everything apart in a way she hadn't prepared for. If the uncle had evidence that could change everything, it could mean even more devastation. Could it be that there was more to the father's behavior than she had ever realized? The judge, after a long pause, nodded. "We'll take a recess to review this new information." He motioned to the bailiff, who moved to take the folder. The courtroom erupted into whispers, but the mother couldn't hear them. All she could hear was the sound of her own heartbeat, racing in her chest. The stakes had just been raised higher than she ever imagined. The next few minutes would decide everything. Would this new twist lead to a breakthrough, or would it open up an even darker chapter in their story? The gavel came down once again, signaling another break. But as the courtroom emptied, one thing was clear. No one would leave the room unchanged. The truth was closer than ever, but how much further would they have to go to uncover it? The room was eerily quiet as the judge returned, the folder of new evidence now in front of him. His eyes scanned the contents, his expression growing more serious with each passing moment. The weight of the situation seemed to grow heavier with every second. The mother's heart raced. She had no idea what was inside that folder, but she knew it was the moment that could change everything. The judge finally set the folder down and looked at the courtroom, his eyes sweeping across the faces of those gathered. The tension was unbearable. He adjusted his glasses and then, in a calm yet deliberate voice, addressed the court. "I've reviewed the information provided by Mr. Montgomery," he began, his eyes briefly flicking to the uncle. "I must admit, this new evidence paints a picture that was not previously apparent. However, this court will not be swayed by speculation alone. We need facts." The defense attorney shot a sharp glance at the judge, but the judge continued undeterred. "The witnesses Mr. Montgomery has referenced have yet to be formally presented to this court, and until that happens, we cannot consider this information fully. But what we do have is the testimony of the young girl, and it is her truth we must consider." The mother, who had been holding her breath throughout this whole exchange, felt a brief moment of relief. The judge wasn't rushing to give weight to the uncle's claims. He was focused on the truth her daughter had spoken. It felt like a small victory, but she knew the battle was far from over. The little girl shifted in her seat, glancing up at her mother. The uncertainty was written on her face. She wasn't sure what was happening, but she could feel the weight of it. The father, on the other hand, was visibly shaking with rage. His face was red, his fists clenched tightly, but there was nothing he could do to stop the momentum now. The uncle, seeing the battle was not yet won, stepped forward one last time. His voice, however, was not filled with the confidence he had shown earlier. Instead, it was strained, almost desperate. "Your Honor, I need to clarify something," he said, swallowing hard. "The evidence I have, it's not just about the past. It's about what's happening now. And the truth is more complicated than anyone knows. What my brother has done, what he's been involved in, it's been hidden for far too long." The mother's stomach twisted again, and the father's eyes widened with alarm. The room went still. The uncle's words hung in the air like a bomb waiting to explode. The judge's eyes narrowed, his hand hovering over the gavel as he processed the gravity of the situation. The uncle continued, his voice barely above a whisper now. "There are things about my brother's actions, things that I didn't fully understand until recently. Things I wish I could have stopped, but couldn't." His eyes flicked toward the father, and for a moment, the entire courtroom was suspended in that brief moment of tension. Then, with a sudden shift, the uncle's demeanor changed. His shoulders slumped as if the weight of what he was about to say had taken all the air out of him. "I can't defend him anymore," he said, his voice breaking. "I've seen too much. I know too much now. And I can't let this continue." The courtroom was silent as the truth began to unfold before them. The uncle, the one person who had been the last bastion of support for the father, was now turning against him. It was a shift no one had expected, least of all the father himself. His face was a mask of disbelief and anger, but it was too late to hide the cracks in the facade. The judge, sensing the shift, motioned for the room to quiet down. He looked at the father one last time. "Mr. Montgomery, is this true?" he asked, his voice firm. The father's eyes burned with rage, but for the first time, there was something else there too: fear. The weight of the truth, the evidence, and his brother's betrayal was closing in on him. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. The courtroom waited for an answer that never came. And then, just when it seemed like the father might say something, a new voice cut through the tension. The little girl, who had been sitting quietly, spoke up in a soft but firm tone. "He hurt me," she said, her words clear and certain, her eyes locked on her father. "And I'm not scared of him anymore." The room went silent. Her words were the final blow. The father, who had manipulated and controlled for so long, now stood exposed. His daughter's testimony, his brother's betrayal, and the weight of everything he had done in the dark all came crashing down in that single, quiet moment. The judge's gavel came down hard, signaling the end of the trial. The decision was made. Custody was awarded to the mother, and the father's world, built on lies and manipulation, crumbled before him. But even as the judge spoke, a strange sense of finality lingered in the air. The truth had won, but it had come at a great cost. As the courtroom began to empty, the mother stood, her arm around her daughter, feeling the weight of the battle finally lifting. They had won, but the scars from this battle would stay with them forever. However, just as they were about to leave the courtroom, the uncle stepped up to the mother. His face was somber, his eyes dark. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I didn't want it to go this far. I didn't want you to know everything, but I couldn't live with the lies anymore." She nodded, understanding the complexity of the emotions at play. "Thank you," she said softly, knowing that in this strange way, the family had finally come to terms with the truth. But she also knew that the journey ahead would not be without its challenges. The road to healing would be long, and while the truth had been revealed, it wasn't an easy victory. The father may have lost his grip on their lives, but the damage he had done, how much of that could truly be undone? As they left the courtroom, the mother took her daughter's hand, knowing that their story was far from over. It was a new chapter, one filled with uncertainty and potential, but the one thing they could be sure of was that they had each other. And sometimes, that was all that really mattered in the end. But just as they reached the door, a final twist, the father, now in the hallway, watched them from a distance. His face was hollow, a man undone. But in his eyes was something darker, something unresolved. His defeat wasn't the end of his story. The audience had seen him break, but there was a glimmer of something far more dangerous brewing behind his gaze. The story, it seemed, was far from over. As the mother and daughter walked out of the courtroom, the weight of what had just happened seemed to finally sink in. For so long, it had felt like they were trapped in a never-ending nightmare, but now, as they stepped into the bright sunlight, there was a sense of liberation. The trial, the tension, the battles, they were all over. And yet, there was a part of her that couldn't shake the feeling that this victory wasn't as sweet as she had imagined. She glanced down at her daughter, whose face was still a mix of confusion and relief. The little girl's eyes, so full of innocence, had borne the burden of this entire ordeal. She had been brave, stronger than anyone could have expected. Her mother pulled her close, pressing a gentle kiss to the top of her head. "You did it," she whispered, her voice filled with pride. "You're so brave." The little girl smiled softly, but it was clear she was still processing everything that had unfolded. The truth had come out, but it didn't undo the pain, didn't erase the years of fear and uncertainty. But it was a start, and that was something. As they walked down the steps, the mother caught sight of the father, still lingering in the hallway, his back turned to them. His shoulders were slumped, defeated, but the flicker in his eyes told a different story. He was broken, yes, but only for now. The look in his eyes suggested that he wasn't finished. He would never be the man he once was, but the darkness that had always been there wasn't gone. It was merely waiting. The mother didn't want to waste another moment thinking about him. She had fought long enough for her daughter's safety, for their peace. It was time to move forward. She tightened her grip on her daughter's hand, and together they walked past him without a word. There was nothing left to say. In the weeks that followed, the mother worked to rebuild their lives. The custody battle had been won, but the aftermath was still a journey of healing. The little girl attended therapy sessions, gradually opening up about the things she had kept locked inside for so long. The trauma was deep, but the healing process was just beginning. They had both been through so much, but the road ahead, though uncertain, was theirs to walk together. The uncle, though initially distant, stayed in touch. His role in the trial had come with its own consequences. While he had helped expose the truth, his betrayal of his own brother had made him a target in a family that had already been broken by secrets. But the mother was grateful for his intervention. He had risked a lot, and even though his actions had added complexity to an already difficult situation, he had done what was right. It wasn't easy, but it was the right thing to do. As for the father, his life was in ruins. The story of his manipulative behavior, his lies, and the truth about his abuse of power had spread quickly, reaching beyond the courtroom. The public opinion shifted, and with it his reputation. He had been a figure of authority, someone others had respected and feared.
But now he was a pariah.
The damage he had caused couldn't be undone by his tears or his regret. The truth had been exposed, and he would have to live with the consequences for the rest of his life. In the months that followed, the mother's life slowly began to regain a sense of normalcy. She found peace in the quiet moments, in the days spent with her daughter, free from fear. They traveled together, something they had always dreamed of doing but never had the chance because of the father's control over their lives. They started new traditions, building memories that didn't have to be tainted by the past. But despite the newfound peace, the shadows of what had happened remained. The scars were deep, and the trauma didn't just vanish because the legal battle was over. The mother knew that they would continue to face challenges, but they would face them together. No longer alone. No longer living in fear. The final resolution of the case came months later, when the judge's ruling became permanent. The father's parental rights were officially revoked, and he was ordered to attend counseling for his behavior. But it was clear to everyone involved that this was not the end of the story. It was merely a chapter closed. The little girl's bravery had sparked the truth, but the journey of healing was still unfolding. The mother, while grateful for the outcome, knew that the true work was only just beginning. The courtroom drama was over, but the real work of rebuilding trust, mending hearts, and forging a new path had only begun. It wouldn't be easy. There would be days when the past resurfaced, when the weight of everything that had happened felt too heavy to bear. But the mother and daughter had each other, and together, they would navigate the rough waters ahead. They had emerged from the storm, scarred but not broken. In the end, what stood out most was the strength of the little girl. Her courage to speak the truth had changed the course of their lives. She had told the judge the truth about her father, and in doing so, she had freed them both. It wasn't just a victory in court. It was a victory for their futures, a chance to rebuild what had been taken from them. And as the years passed, the memories of the trial faded into the background, but the lessons remained. The mother taught her daughter about the importance of speaking up, of finding your voice even when it feels impossible. She showed her that there is always hope, even when the world seems dark and uncertain. That love, resilience, and the courage to stand up for what's right could lead to a brighter future. The scars would never completely fade, but with each passing day, they healed a little more. And in the end, the mother and daughter found peace, not in the absence of pain, but in the strength they found in each other and the truth they had both fought so hard to uncover. Their story was one of pain and triumph, but also of healing, hope, and the undeniable power of truth. The truth that had shattered their world, but ultimately set them free.